The shock did not come from what the American aircraft looked like on radar, but from where it was. In the early 1970s, Soviet air defense crews along the northern and western approaches of the USSR began reporting a recurring anomaly. High-speed targets were appearing at extreme altitude, maintaining steady tracks along sensitive borders, then departing before any interceptor could close the distance. These were not satellites. The flight path was too controlled, too deliberate. Nor were they bombers. No bomber could survive at those heights and speeds. What Soviet commanders were observing was something far more unsettling. A manned aircraft operating in a region of the atmosphere long considered impractical for sustained flight. At the center of this challenge was the American state Route 71 Blackbird, a reconnaissance platform developed at the height of Cold War anxiety. Designed by Lockheed Skunk Works under Clarence Kelly Johnson, the aircraft was engineered to solve a specific strategic problem. After the downing of the U-2 in 1960, the United States required a system capable of penetrating heavily defended airspace without relying on stealth or escort. The solution was neither subtle nor defensive. It was based on physics. Fly higher than surface-to-air missiles could reach. Fly faster than interceptors could pursue. Accept enormous technical risk to gain strategic certainty. The Blackbird entered operational service in 1966 with a flight profile unlike anything in the Soviet inventory. Cruising above 80,000 feet and at speeds exceeding Mach 3, it occupied a narrow band of altitude where air density was minimal and aerodynamic margins were unforgiving. At those heights, traditional control surfaces lost effectiveness, engines struggled for oxygen, and even minor errors could cascade into catastrophic failure. Yet the state Route 71 was designed to live there. Its titanium structure expanded dramatically in flight, sealing fuel tanks that leaked on the ground. Its engines functioned as turbojets at low speed and transitioned toward ramjet behavior at cruise. The aircraft did not evade defenses by hiding. It outran them. For Soviet planners, this posed a direct challenge to national air defense doctrine. The Soviet Union had invested heavily in layered defenses built around early warning radar, long-range surface-to-air missiles, and high-speed interceptors. If an American aircraft could simply fly above this entire system, then the defensive architecture itself was being rendered obsolete. The response was predictable but urgent. Interceptor units were placed on alert. New engagement envelopes were calculated. Pilots were briefed on a target that, on paper, appeared within reach. The MiG-25 Foxbat, designed for extreme speed and high-altitude interception, was assigned as the answer. What Soviet pilots would soon discover was that speed alone was not enough. The problem was not how fast the Blackbird flew, but where it chose to fly. And that realization would fundamentally reshape how both sides understood the limits of air power. The MiG-25 was conceived as a weapon against a specific fear. In the early 1960s, Soviet intelligence believed the United States was developing supersonic bombers capable of penetrating deep into Soviet territory at very high altitude. The Foxbat was built to meet that threat head-on. It emphasized raw speed, rate of climb, and powerful radar-guided missiles over maneuverability or endurance. With its massive Tamansky R-15 engines and steep climb profile, the MiG-25 could reach altitudes above 70,000 feet in minutes, placing it among the highest-flying combat aircraft ever fielded at the time. On paper, the numbers looked promising. Maximum speed exceeded Mach 2.8 under operational limits. The Interceptor carried large R-40 missiles designed to destroy high-altitude targets at long range. Ground-controlled interception doctrine would vector pilots into precise firing positions, minimizing the need for complex maneuvering. Against bombers or reconnaissance aircraft operating within expected envelopes, the system worked. Against the state Route 71, it did not. When Soviet radar stations detected a Blackbird mission, interceptor regiments were scrambled according to established procedure. Pilots climbed aggressively, following vectors transmitted from ground controllers tracking the American aircraft. As altitude increased, the environment changed rapidly. Control response diminished. Engine temperatures surged. Fuel consumption rose sharply. By the time Foxbats approached 75,000 feet, they were already operating at the edge of their flight envelope. Any attempt to climb higher risked compressor stall, flameout, or loss of control. The problem became painfully clear during repeated intercept attempts. The State Route 71 was not only flying faster than expected, it was flying higher. Later assessments placed its typical operational altitude around 85,000 feet, with potential excursions beyond that under certain conditions. At those heights, the MiG-25 could no longer generate sufficient lift or thrust to maneuver into a firing position. Even if the interceptor briefly reached similar altitude in a zoom climb, it lacked the energy and stability needed to guide a missile shot. Missile engagement posed its own limitations. Radar performance degraded in the thin upper atmosphere. Lock-on ranges were shorter than anticipated. The geometry of the intercept favored the American aircraft, which could detect interceptor activity early and adjust speed accordingly. Standard Blackbird procedure in response to a threat was brutally simple. Increase speed. The State Route 71 did not evade laterally. It extended the distance until pursuit was impossible. For MiG-25 pilots, the experience was deeply unsettling. They were flying one of the fastest aircraft in the world, executing their orders precisely, yet the target remained unreachable. Some pilots reported brief visual contact, a dark shape against a deepening sky, already pulling away. After-action debriefs reflected mounting frustration. The interceptor had met its specifications. The doctrine had been followed. The failure lay elsewhere. What Soviet commanders were forced to confront was a doctrinal mismatch. Air defense systems optimized for speed and firepower were ineffective when altitude itself became the primary shield. The Americans had shifted the engagement into a realm where physics, not tactics, dictated the outcome. The implications of this mismatch extended beyond individual intercept failures. Within Soviet air defense headquarters, analysts began reviewing engagement data with increasing concern. Each State Route 71 mission followed a similar pattern. Early warning radars detected the aircraft at extreme range. Tracking data showed a stable course and constant speed. Interceptor units scrambled on time. Missiles were armed. Yet the outcome never changed. The American aircraft passed through surveillance coverage, completed its reconnaissance run, and exited before any weapon system could be brought to bear. Part of the problem lay in assumptions that had guided Soviet planning for years. High-altitude flight was traditionally viewed as a temporary phase, something an aircraft might reach briefly during a climb or zoom maneuver before descending back into denser air. Sustained cruise above 80,000 feet was considered inefficient and impractical. Engines lost thrust, materials weakened under thermal stress, and pilots faced physiological limits even in pressure suits. Soviet engineers had accounted for these constraints in their designs. Lockheed's engineers had chosen to confront them directly. At 85,000 feet, the atmosphere behaves differently. Air density is less than a quarter of what it is at 40,000 feet. Lift margins shrink dramatically. Control surfaces become sluggish. Missile guidance systems, particularly those relying on radar reflection and predictable target movement, struggle to maintain stable tracking solutions. Even when Soviet surface-to-air missile sites attempted engagements, the physics worked against them. Missiles bled energy rapidly during climbs into the upper atmosphere. By the time they approached the Blackbird's altitude, they lacked the speed needed for interception. Soviet doctrine emphasized layered defense, with overlapping radar coverage feeding centralized command posts. This system depended on the assumption that hostile aircraft would eventually descend into engagement zones. The State Route 71 broke that logic. It remained above every layer. Radar operators could see it. Commanders could track it. But no system could reach it. The difference between detection and engagement became painfully obvious. This reality created a psychological strain within interceptor units. Pilots trained for years to master high-altitude interception profiles, yet were repeatedly ordered into missions they knew were unlikely to succeed. Scramble alarms still triggered immediate response. Engines still roared on takeoff. Climbs were still pushed to the limit. But confidence eroded. Debriefings increasingly focused on fuel states, ceiling limitations, and warning indicators rather than firing solutions. The mission was no longer about stopping the intruder. It was about proving that every possible attempt had been made. On the American side, These encounters reinforced confidence in the Blackbird's operating concept. Mission planners understood that interception attempts were routine. They factored them into routes and timing. The aircraft's performance envelope was not just sufficient. It was decisive. In this narrow band of altitude and speed, the State Route 71 was functionally immune not by chance but by design. As confidence in traditional interception eroded, Soviet engineers and strategists searched for alternatives. If speed and climb performance could not close the gap, perhaps technology could. Radar systems were examined first. Existing ground-based radars were optimized for targets operating within known aerodynamic regimes. At extreme altitude, radar returns became less stable, affected by the curvature of the Earth, atmospheric refraction, and the shallow aspect angles presented by a cruising State Route 71. Tracking was possible, but precision suffered, especially during rapid geometry changes when the Blackbird accelerated or altered altitude slightly. This led to attempts at refining fire control solutions for both interceptors and surface-to-air missiles. New guidance algorithms were studied, along with improved prediction models that assumed higher target ceilings and sustained supersonic cruise. Yet these were theoretical fixes to a practical problem. Even with perfect tracking data, the engagement envelope remained unforgiving. Missiles required time to climb. Interceptors required excess thrust to maneuver. At 85,000 feet, neither had much margin left. The MiG-31, which entered service in the early 1980s, represented a serious effort to address these shortcomings. It featured more powerful engines, advanced radar capable of tracking targets at greater range, and longer-range missiles designed for high-altitude interception. On paper, it narrowed the gap. In practice, the same constraints applied. At extreme altitude, the aircraft's ability to maneuver was limited, and the speed advantage of the State Route 71, even if relatively small in absolute terms, translated into overwhelming separation over time. Detection still came early. Intercept geometry still collapsed before weapons release. Behind closed doors, Soviet military assessments became increasingly candid. Declassified analyses from the period acknowledged that conventional air defense systems had no reliable counter to the Blackbird during its operational peak. Some proposals explored more extreme solutions, including specialized high-altitude missiles and even nuclear-armed interceptors. These concepts reflected frustration as much as innovation. They were acknowledgments that the problem was not one of tactics alone, but of physics and engineering. For Soviet pilots, the experience fostered a complex mix of professional respect and quiet resentment. They recognized the achievement represented by an aircraft that could operate where theirs could not. At the same time, repeated failure carried institutional consequences. Scramble statistics were logged. Performance limits were scrutinized. Yet no pilot could change the fundamental reality of thrust, lift, and fuel at the edge of the atmosphere. The Blackbird's success was not accidental or fragile. It was sustained over decades across evolving Soviet defenses, precisely because it occupied a domain few others could enter. By redefining where reconnaissance could occur, it forced an adversary to confront the limits of established doctrine. And in doing so, it reshaped the strategic balance of aerial surveillance throughout the Cold War. By the mid-1980s, the consequences of this imbalance were fully understood on both sides. The State Route 71 had become a routine but uncontestable presence along the periphery of the Soviet Union and other sensitive regions. Each flight produced streams of intelligence that fed directly into strategic planning. Airfields, missile deployments, naval movements, and infrastructure changes were documented with a level of clarity that satellite imagery of the period could not always match. The aircraft's value was not simply that it could see, but that it could be sent when needed, following tailored routes rather than predictable orbits. This flexibility magnified the frustration felt by Soviet air defense commanders. Satellites could be masked, activity concealed until after an overflight. The Blackbird allowed no such preparation. Its missions could be launched on short notice, its approach masked by speed, its presence known only when radar returns appeared far above engagement range. The mere detection of an State Route 71 flight often triggered heightened alerts across air defense networks, consuming manpower, fuel, and readiness cycles for an outcome that had already proven inevitable. Yet the aircraft itself was not without vulnerability. Operating at extreme altitude and speed imposed relentless strain. Thermal expansion stressed airframes. Engines ran near material limits. Minor malfunctions that would be manageable in conventional aircraft became potentially fatal at Mach 3. Crews relied on pressure suits similar to those worn by astronauts, and any failure at altitude could be catastrophic. The confidence that pilots projected was built on training, discipline, and trust in engineering, not on any illusion of invulnerability. This reality added weight to every mission. While Soviet pilots strained upward below them, State Route 71 crews understood that their safety depended entirely on systems functioning as designed. There were no diversion airfields beneath hostile territory. Ejection above 50,000 feet offered little chance of survival. The aircraft's survivability rested on maintaining speed and altitude, leaving no margin for hesitation or error. As reconnaissance satellites improved and geopolitical tensions shifted, questions emerged within the United States about cost and redundancy. The State Route 71 was expensive to operate, demanding specialized fuel, maintenance, and highly trained crews. Advocates argued that no satellite could replace its responsiveness or adaptability. Critics pointed to emerging alternatives. The debate reflected changing priorities rather than diminished respect for the aircraft's achievements. For Soviet planners, the lesson was sobering. Decades of investment in interception and missile technology had failed to close a critical gap. The experience reinforced an understanding that future air defense would require entirely new approaches, not incremental refinement of existing ones. High-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance had exposed the limits of a system built for a different fight. The retirement of the State Route 71 did not mark the failure of its concept, but the completion of its purpose. By the late 1990s, the strategic environment had changed. Satellites had improved dramatically. Unmanned systems began to assume roles once reserved for manned reconnaissance. Budget pressures forced difficult choices. Yet the record the Blackbird left behind remained unmatched. For more than 3 decades, it flew through the most heavily defended airspace on the planet without a single loss to enemy action. Dozens of intercept attempts, hundreds of scrambles, and the result was always the same: detection without denial. For the MiG-25 pilots who strained upward in pursuit, the experience became part of a larger professional legacy. They flew one of the fastest interceptors ever built, executed their orders with discipline, and pushed their aircraft to its absolute limits. Their failure was not personal, nor even technical in the narrow sense. It was systemic. The engagement had been shifted into a realm where speed and missiles were no longer enough, where altitude itself became the decisive factor. The encounter between the State Route 71 and the MiG-25 stands as a clear example of how doctrine, technology, and physics intersect. One side optimized for interception within known boundaries. The other quietly moved beyond them. The lesson resonates beyond the Cold War. Air power is not defined solely by weapons or platforms, but by the ability to operate where an adversary cannot follow. That is why the Blackbird still commands attention decades after its last flight. Not as a symbol of invincibility, but as proof that understanding the limits of the environment can be more decisive than trying to dominate it. If you found this deep dive into Cold War air power and technological competition valuable, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps support more serious, historically grounded explorations of military history and the systems that shaped it.